Well, thanks so much. It was a terrific turnout. I'm deeply appreciative that so many people would come. Very much appreciated the sort of the update on the school. I mean, I know a lot about how we got to where we are, but listening to the update really affirmed for me that we got the right dean to be our leader, and I really feel good about that. So I'm going to talk relatively briefly, I think around 20-25 minutes. The idea is then the dean and I will sit down and we'll go back and forth a little bit, then open things up for questions, and we're going to then adjourn for refreshments in about an hour and 2 or 3 minutes. So title of the talk, something like, Is There an Escape from Permanent War? I am, in fact, hard at work on a book that has the working title, America's War for the Greater Middle East. I'm on chapter 3. I've just finished with the Soviets in Afghanistan being undermined by the CIA, and I just transitioned to the Marines entering into Lebanon in 1982-83. The MOOC that the dean referred to is really a hastily drafted sort of first effort at the book. The premise of the book is this: that for well over 30 years now, intensive and continuing U.S. military engagement in various quarters of the Islamic world deserves to be seen not simply as one damn thing after another, but as one war, a war with many facets, conducted in many theaters, but nonetheless one war. Yes, there have been various battles and campaigns, some large, some small, but they all add up to something. Tick off the countries in this region that U.S. forces in recent decades have invaded, occupied, garrisoned, bombed, or raided, and where American soldiers have killed or been killed. Since 1980, they include Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, but also Iran, Lebanon, Libya, Turkey, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Bosnia, Kosovo, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Pakistan, and now Syria. The list just keeps getting longer. The premise underlying this war can be simply stated. With disorder, dysfunction, and disarray in the Islamic world posing a growing threat to perceived U.S. vital national security interests, the adroit application of hard power supposedly will enable the United States to check those tendencies and thereby preserve the American way of life. Choose whatever term you like: police, pacify, shape, control, dominate, transform. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter launched the United States on a project aimed at nothing less than determining the fate and future of the peoples inhabiting the Arc of Nations from the Maghreb and the Arabian Peninsula to the Persian Gulf and Central Asia. Only in retrospect does this become clear, of course. At the time when President Carter declared the Persian Gulf a vital national security interest, that was the literal meaning of the Carter Doctrine, he did not intend to embark upon a war, nor did he anticipate what course the war was going to follow, its duration, costs, and consequences. Like the European statesman who 100 years ago this year touched off the cataclysm we know today as World War I, Carter merely lit a fuse without knowing where it led. But look closely enough, and the dots connect, much as, say, the Berlin airlift, the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the invasion of Grenada, among many other events. All constitute episodes in what we call the Cold War. So too seemingly disparate events such as the Beirut bombing of 1983, the Black Hawk Down debacle of 1993, the Iraq invasion of 2003, among many other events, all form part of a single narrative. So, how are we doing? Well, let me state plainly my own overall assessment. We have not won this war. We are not winning this war. and simply pressing on is unlikely to produce more positive results next year or the year after. Now, to the extent that that evaluation is accurate, why then does this war persist? Or at least, why is it that the world's most powerful nation can't find a way out of an enterprise that shows such few signs of success? Why don't we just pick up our marbles and go home? Well, let me posit briefly 4 explanations. First, in Washington, the forces favoring the status quo are too powerful and too entrenched. Collectively, these forces constitute something we might call the national security lobby, which wields a lot more clout than does the Israel lobby, and that's saying something. The national security lobby is centered on the national security apparatus, meaning the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and other related federal agencies. But it also includes certain congressional committees, think tanks, contractors, lobbyists, publications, and even certain academic programs, although I'm pleased to say none here at Boston University. All of these are devoted to the proposition that the United States faces dire threats and that national security must remain priority number 1. The mantra of the national security lobby is this: the world of today is more dangerous than it was yesterday, and all the signs indicate that it will be more dangerous still tomorrow. Now that's a position nicely designed to fend off any reduction in their status and their prerogatives. Together, the institutions comprising the national security lobby choke off any real debate over alternative strategies, fostering the impression that the United States really has no choice but to forge on. It's not that there are not strategic alternatives on offer. It's just that inside the Beltway, or more generally in national politics, those alternatives have no real standing. Second factor, the costs that the nation is incurring by perpetuating this seemingly endless conflict are too indistinct. A distinguishing characteristic of the war for the greater Middle East is that Washington has largely succeeded in insulating ordinary Americans from its effects. You know, I think most of us think of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars as big wars, but by historical standards, they have been anything but that. Indeed, when compared to the world wars, or even to Korea and Vietnam, they qualify as relatively trivial. Compare the size of the forces committed and the casualties sustained in those various wars. U.S. forces in Iraq topped out at about 130,000, and in Afghanistan at 100,000. Not because that was the number of troops required to win, but because that was the number of troops that policymakers chose to make available. What they made available did not suffice to achieve success, but that matters less than the fact that everyday American life continued undisturbed. Only in fiscal terms do Iraq and Afghanistan qualify as really big wars. And there, Washington has worked hard to conceal the implications. No increase in taxes, no curtailment of consumption, just piling on of more and more debt. And this approach has worked. Since permanent war doesn't really cause significant immediate pain to the American people, the demand for accountability does not rise to the level where it might receive serious attention. So less than satisfactory outcomes get shrugged off. Note, for example, the absence of significant attention paid to foreign policy in the national elections that are being concluded today. Third factor, the apparent risks of advocating change are too high. Now here I'm talking about risks to politicians. To insist upon accountability, or at least a critical assessment of policy, say for example the way that Senator J. William Fulbright and others did during the Vietnam, To do that today is to go out on a limb. You would open yourself up to the charge of not supporting the troops, or of being an isolationist, or of not believing in American global leadership, or worst of all, not believing in American exceptionalism, in our unique calling to save the world. It's far easier for office holders or those aspiring to political office to recite platitudes about having the world's greatest military and how our soldiers are out there fighting for freedom, democracy, and to keep us safe. In other words, cowardly politicians shy away from confronting their constituents with difficult truths. And sadly, we let them get away with it. Fourth factor, the momentum of events is too relentless. I'm generally skeptical of that old chestnut about the pace of events being faster today than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But in the greater Middle East, it just might be true. How shall we characterize what is going on in this region? An implosion? A realignment? A restoration? A casting off of an alien order imposed by outsiders? I'm really not sure. But you do get a sense that the tempo is accelerating, at least in part as an unintended consequence of past U.S. military interventions gone awry. The rise of ISIS offers an illustration of what I mean. Its appearance blindsided the Obama administration and the national security apparatus. But ISIS is hardly the only example. The Arab Spring caught Washington by surprise, as did the Iraqi insurgency that began back in 2003, 2004, as did 9/11 itself. Washington somehow never catches up, and therefore Washington has no time to think. There's just crisis response and crisis management, which in effect has the effect of insulating the status quo. So is there any prospect of the U.S. escaping from permanent war? Well, none that I can see. But of course that reflects my generally pessimistic disposition. I know that Dean Najam expects something that at least hints of sunshine, so I'll do my best and argue that we need not despair. Here are some signs to hopeful signs that we might at least look for. I do not intend these as predictions, but things that, were they to occur, might be the equivalent of the first robin appearing at the end of a very long, very cold winter. 3 points. First, a recently retired U.S. Army three-star general is about to publish a book called Why We Lost. It's his account of Iraq and Afghanistan. He served in both theaters. And the admission contained in the book's title strikes me as a refreshing one. Is his book a sign that the officer corps is willing to undertake an honest evaluation of actual U.S. military performance during this era of putative global supremacy? Well, were that to be the case, I hope it will be the case, were that to be the case, an interesting debate over the fundamentals of U.S. military policy possibly could ensue. Second, for better or worse, another presidential campaign approaches. It'll basically start tomorrow morning. Let's see if in this next presidential campaign, an alternative to so-called global leadership gets a hearing. Rand Paul pretty obviously will run for the Republican nomination. Former Senator Jim Webb may be considering a run for the Democratic nomination, and I, for one, hope that he does. What matters is not whether either of these men could actually secure the nomination, but the possibility that their presence in the campaign just might open the door for a serious discussion of foreign policy alternatives, because both of these guys are basically going to represent, if not an anti-interventionist perspective, at least a perspective that is skeptical of what interventionism in the greater Middle East can possibly accomplish. Third and last point. It appears that behind closed doors, the negotiations between the United States and Iran over Iran's nuclear program continue. I haven't the faintest idea as to whether those negotiations will succeed. But imagine that they do, leading to a thaw in U.S.-Iranian relations. Such a development could be of equal importance to Nixon's opening to China back in the 1970s, leading to a massive realignment of strategic relationships. Now, I doubt that world peace would result, but the possibility of new foreign policy choices would present itself, perhaps making it possible for the United States to extricate itself from what appears to be an endless and permanent war. It's an interesting possibility to contemplate. With that, I'll stop and look forward to our conversation and to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. Will you join us here? And thank you for this wonderful talk. Andy Bacevich, Professor Emeritus of History and of International Relations, has laid out for us a whole set of big questions. Can I start with the one I was hoping for an answer for in my intro? The idea of the greater Middle East. And when we name the war that way, which your book shall, and therefore that shall become part of how we frame this. Does that have implications? That does have reality? Does that change the nature of what we now call the Middle East? All the countries you listed, Muslim.
Well, I think, first of all, when I was writing chapter 2 of this book, which focused on the origins of U.S. Central Command, which is the regional command that is responsible not for the entire greater Middle East, but to the preponderance of the greater Middle East. I was struck by the insistence upon the people creating CENTCOM that it would have responsibility for what they call an area of responsibility encompassing what they called the greater Middle East. So it's not simply a label that I'm choosing on my own and imposing on a set of events. It's a label that policymakers at the American policymakers at the outset of this sequence of events were themselves choosing. What does it do? Well, what it does is, it seems to me that it blurs distinctions between countries, and therefore facilitates lazy thinking that does not trouble itself with specific circumstances and differences between countries and between peoples. It makes it to say that there is a greater Middle East and that we are at war with it, from the point of view of those who are orchestrating the war, seems to make things simple, but probably leads to errors on their part.
If I can just push, and my biases and sort of context would be obvious here, but is it war with the greater Middle East or war in the greater Middle East? It seems to me that if there is a major actor out there who agrees with the war theater being the greater Middle East, it is, for example, ISIS.
But your question is what the preposition is?
Is the war with the greater Middle East or and what does that mean to those countries?
My preposition is for. It's a war from the point of view of the United States has become a war for the greater Middle East. That is to say, a war that aims to determine the political order that will prevail in this very substantial collection of countries.
You asked, should we just collect our marbles and leave? And the answer I heard, check me if I'm wrong, is we may not be able to. But should we, if we could?
Yes, I think we should. Were policymakers able to overcome the sort of obstacles that I aligned, or were the American people to insist that those obstacles be set aside, my argument is that we should demilitarize our policy in the region, radically lower our military profile, give up on the notion that the use of force by outsiders, in other words, not simply by the United States, but by the West more broadly, give up on the notion that that can produce positive outcomes, either positive for us, meaning enhancing our security and well-being, or positive for the people who live in that part of the world. My argument is that there is this is where I go way beyond my expertise, that within the greater Middle East, there is a contest underway with the essence of that contest centering on the question of how to reconcile faith with modernity. And that question can only be answered by the people who live in that region of the world. The effort to answer that question has produced, and in all likely will continue to produce, a great deal of conflict and disorder. The interest of the United States with regard to that conflict and disorder is to insulate ourselves as best we can from its effects, meaning we need to protect ourselves. We need to erect effective defenses. And then on the margins, emphasizing, on the margins, see if there's anything we can do that can have a positive effect, a positive contribution to helping the people of the greater Middle East come to their answer of that core question. And I think that ought to be the essence of American grand strategy with regard to this disorder and dysfunction that is roiling such a large part of the world.
There are indeed profound questions lurking in what you've just said, and I want to leave it to my colleagues and friends here to raise them. But let me ask just one question. We pick up our marbles and leave. Should we even think, and I know you don't like the idea of sort of global leadership, sort of imposing global leadership in the sense that Washington might sometimes do it. What happens to the other kids playing in that dirt-filled environment?
They will face a radically different set of incentives to act. They will have to, let's take the example of ISIS as a case.
Where we have kind of picked the marbles and at least are not playing, we're watching.
Well, I mean, we're taking no, we haven't picked up our marbles with regard to ISIS. We are militarily engaged in that military contest, albeit in a way that does not seem to promise a very positive outcome anytime soon. This whole question of relying on air power, the reluctance to put boots on the ground, etc. But I was going to cite ISIS as an example of a threat, serious, not existential from our point of view, arguably existential from the point of view of some nations in the region, who need to step up to the plate and collaborate with one another in order to fix the problem. As long as the United States insists that it can, must, is attempting to fix the problem, then these other powers, whether we're talking about Turkey, whether we're talking about Saudi Arabia, whether we're talking about Egypt, simply don't have sufficient incentive to be serious about trying to restore stability to the region. And therefore, we underwrite, through our interventionism, to some degree, we underwrite the irresponsible or at least lazy behavior of nations that in one way or another supposedly qualify as our allies.
Unfair question, and I know I'm keeping others from asking, but I must ask this one. Imagine that we do that. We pick up our marbles and leave, and whatever that means. If you were to speculate, what would you bet are the odds that these countries will come together, rise and get out of the laziness and do, quote unquote, the right thing? What are the odds that that will happen as opposed to even worse anarchy? What would you bet on?
I don't know. But as somebody who basically looks at the world through a realist lens, my bet is that the recognition that the United States was not going to continue on its current excessively militarized path would cause these nations to reassess their interests and therefore to reassess their lesser squabbles that have prevented them from behaving responsibly. But let me also emphasize.
For once, you're more optimistic than me. But
no, maybe. But let me also emphasize. I mean, and you know this is true. For whether for better or worse, I'm an American. I'm trying to figure out what's best for my country, and I am persuaded that the course that we are on is not good for the United States of America, and is costing this country dearly in a variety of ways. And therefore, from an American perspective, there needs to be a different course. And as ostensibly the most powerful country in the world, I find it inexcusable that people responsible for policy simply can't discover a plausible alternative course to the one that we're on.
On that note, questions, comments, ideas, thoughts? We have colleagues with a mic. Please do speak in the mic because they're recording this and we should have it up on the web. Gentlemen up here.
Yes, sir. If what you say is true and the Americans leave the area, what do you see ISIS will do? Their desire is to form, as they say, a caliphate and have Sharia law all over the world. What happens if we retrench and we defend ourselves? What do you see happening in the area of the country? Right, if we're not there, how do you see that area of the world under ISIS control now?
Yeah. Can we take just 2 or 3 questions and then Andy can respond collectively? Others, colleagues, up here. No, do please, because they want to record it, so we want to get your question, but
right.
Briefly.
Given that a number of people think that by the year 2018, the United States will no longer be importing oil from the Mideast, first of all, do you think that? And if so, if it is true, what effect will that have?
We'll take one more. Right here, Professor Keeler.
I can yell too.
She'll give you the mic.
In the latter stages of the Cold War, whenever anybody talked about American strategy and policy toward the Middle East, it always came down to oil, keep the Russians out, and defend the State of Israel. As the gentleman just said, oil will recede in importance as the years go on. There are no longer the threat of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. That leaves the question of the security of Israel. What do you think the consequences of a withdrawal would be for the State of Israel and for the region?
So 3 questions. What happens the morning after? What about oil and Israel?
Well, I mean, we may differ on how much of a threat ISIS poses. What do we got? Current estimates are roughly 30,000 fighters. Ivan, you probably keep track of this. They got no Air Force. They got no Navy. They got no weapons of mass destruction. The only armor that they have is armor that they've captured from us, well, or from the Iraqis. They have no serious logistics base. You know, it's a great thing to have a tank, but after you drive it 10 miles, you got a broken part that needs to be repaired. You got to have a warehouse full of parts. There's no question that they are fierce. There's no question that they are brutal. They appear to be pretty darn skillful in terms of the way they play politics. But I don't think we should overstate this threat. Matter of fact, it is their very brutality and the sort of the extremism that they manifest in everything they do that probably is their vulnerability. That at the end of the day, Saudis, Iraqis, Egyptians, Turks are not going to lie down and allow this new caliphate to come into existence. You know, I would very much like my next book to win the Pulitzer Prize for history, but just because I aspire to do that doesn't mean it's going to happen. Just because these guys declare themselves to be the caliphate doesn't mean they're going to be a caliphate. So again, I'm not dismissing ISIS as a problem, but I think it's very important not to overstate the threat that they represent. So I go to New York every Monday, except for this Monday, to teach a course at Columbia just for this semester. I'm racking up big-time Amtrak points because my wife doesn't like me to stay overnight, and I have to go down and back almost every Monday. It makes for a long day. That said, she did come with me 2 weeks ago, and we went out to dinner went to somebody's apartment for dinner, a nice dinner party, and there was a guy there who, I don't even remember his name, but he was an economist, which of course I don't deal with very well.
That's one reason not to remember his name.
Right. And he was teaching at Columbia now after serving in the National Security Council staff of the President administration on energy matters. And I raised the question, well, okay, if it's true that we're going to be energy self-sufficient, at least within North America, or at least within the Western Hemisphere, then shouldn't that make some strategic choices available to us? Doesn't that in and of itself reduce the importance of the Persian Gulf? It was the importance of Persian Gulf oil that got us into this mess in the first place. And I was struck by the economist's answer, which is that, oh no, the price of oil is determined by global forces and it really doesn't matter where it's coming from and blah, 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 blah. And he certainly elicited a reaction from me because I thought to myself, you're going to tell me that U.S. foreign policy needs to be a prisoner of some supposed general laws of economics? And if that's the case, then what is the significance of our power? So the point you raise, to me, is crucially important. If the war for the Greater Middle East began as a war about oil, if indeed we seem to be on the verge of something approximating energy self-sufficiency, then that really ought to, in Washington, stimulate a debate over first-order questions about our interests and the options available to us. But my sense is that hasn't happened. And I find that very disappointing, but frankly emblematic of the lack of imagination and creativity that seems to be so much part of the policy world today. Israel. I mean, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The interests of the United States and the interests of Israel do not align in some very, very important ways. I think I understand why Israel has the security priorities that it has, and why Israel behaves as it does. And were I an Israeli, I might even think that it made sense. But I'm not an Israeli. I'm an American. And from the point of view of the United States of America, there are various aspects of Israeli behavior that simply are not in our interests, and we need to be able to say it out loud and to cease being an enabler of Israeli behavior that does not contribute to the security and well-being of the United States. The continuing expansion of settlements is a very good example of that. The pummeling of the population of Gaza is an example of that. And we should not abandon Israel. We should not somehow claim that Israel is at fault in all respects, but we need to give up this notion repeated endlessly by our politicians, to include President Obama, even though he doesn't really believe it, that somehow there can be no daylight between ourselves and Israel. It's not conducive to the well-being of the United States. Frankly, it's not conducive to the well-being of Israel, because it encourages them to do things that are stupid and that won't benefit Israel in the long run.
Second round.
Obviously, I am not eligible for election to any office in this country.
Thank you very much for coming to speak to us. My question relates to one of your statements. You said that there is a tendency in Washington to oversimplify the greater Middle East. I was wondering whether or not that's a symptom of just incompetence, or whether or not that's something necessary in order to justify the existence of the military-industrial complex in the United States. Thank you.
We'll take again a couple more, if that's okay. Ivan? Okay. And then that gentleman.
So, great. You mentioned realism, and I wonder what you think of this idea, because Realism 101 used to be, at least when I started learning it, was the idea that you balance or engage capabilities and not intentions. And why I bring that up is because it strikes me that after the Second Intifada, after Ariel Sharon sparks things off by going to the holy sites, that you could make the argument that the U.S. sort of caught this Israeli disease of balancing against intentions rather than balancing against capabilities, and that's why we, since then, have sort of systematically overinflated threats against us, because, as one of the gentlemen pointed out, we tend to look at what their aims are rather than what their capabilities to reach it are, and then we inflate the threat to match the aims rather than to match the capacity to reach it. I wonder what you think about that.
One third question there, and then we'll come back to Andy.
Good evening. I'm curious, if we take at face value your assessment that the debate that's causing these conflicts is between modernity and religiosity, I'm curious how that debate gets resolved in an environment of insecurity, because ISIS certainly has an answer to that question. And that's not an answer that I like, and I don't think it's an answer that many people in the Middle East like. And it strikes me that if the U.S. is to withdraw, it's perhaps giving a monopoly on power to one answer to that question. Thank you.
Andy.
If indeed there's a tendency to oversimplify, if policymakers tend to oversimplify who benefits, when I was writing this chapter on the origins of CENTCOM, one of the things that struck me was, and I was looking at what the first CENTCOM commanders, how they articulated their understanding of the region for which they were assuming responsibility. And what struck me was the complete absence of any awareness of culture, of religion, of a history that had shaped that part of the world. And who benefits is the commander of CENTCOM in this case, who reduces the problem of his area of responsibility to terms that he's comfortable with, terms that relate to terrain, that relate to distance and the challenges of projecting force, that relate to force structure of adversaries. Whether they initially imagined the adversary was the Soviet Union. As soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, they immediately inserted Iraq into that position. But remarkably little sensitivity to what we might say are non-military or non-operational considerations. And I think that's who benefits. I wrote an article about 2 or 3 years ago called something like the Israelification of U.S. policy, which makes exactly that point. And what I was saying is I can't establish a causal relationship. I have no evidence that people in the Pentagon or in the National Security Council get up in the morning and say, hey, Israel did that, why don't we do it? But there's a remarkable, it seems to me, parallel track of, for example, the United States embracing Israel's penchant for preventive action that has been counterproductive and probably immoral. So I think the phenomenon that you point to is a very real and a very pernicious one. How to resolve, if to the extent that what I postulate is correct about this great contest between faith and modernity, I just don't think that we have any real capacity to resolve it. Your assumption seems to be that first of all, your assumption seems to be that the forces of faith are necessarily retrograde in their attitude, which need not be the case. And your question also seems to assume that proponents of modernity or of a more secular order or of an order in which secular life and religious life can operate in different spheres that are nonetheless not antagonistic with one another. Your assumption seems to be those forces are very weak. That's simply not my perception. I do think that the struggle, if there is indeed such a struggle ongoing, is going to take a hell of a long time to resolve itself. It took quite a period of time in the West, in the aftermath of the Reformation with the rise of the Enlightenment, for us in the West to arrive at whatever sort of ceasefire that we have in our own religious wars. And it's probably going to take a comparable length of time for the Islamic world to reach that same outcome. Now, if somebody can make a plausible argument to me that somehow or other American power can accelerate that process, that we can identify the good guys in this contest. I'm not sure who they are, but if we can identify the good guys and help the good guys prevail, and if we can do that at relatively modest cost to ourselves, then I'm saying, let's go for it. But my reading of the course of this military contest that we've been engaged in for over 3 decades suggests that we can't make things better. And indeed, the more we muck around militarily, we actually end up making things worse. And the beginning of wisdom is to acknowledge that, rather than to retreat behind this notion of the world needs us, we are all powerful, and therefore we have some supposed self-assigned obligation to stick our noses into matters that we really don't understand.
Andy, can I come back to the morning after question? We take our marbles and leave. Who comes into that neighborhood with their marbles? The assumption is we leave.
I'm hoping the Chinese will. I'd love to see the Chinese stuck with all the problems we have as they try to bring order, as they try to bring modernity, as they try to protect a reservoir of oil.
That's one way to become a great power again.
That they actually need much more than we need. But again, what I think would be more like I know you don't mean this, but it's as if we treat countries in that part of the world as if they are irresponsible infants. Why need that be the case? Why can't Saudi Arabia, which has played an utterly irresponsible and reckless role over much of the last several decades, to include in countries such as your own, why can't they grow up? And it seems to me, as long as, I'm repeating myself here, as long as we insist that somehow we preside over this region of the world, they have no incentive to think critically about their behavior. And by the way, the same thing applies to the State of Israel. The State of Israel has no incentive to think seriously about a real live, no kidding, two-state solution, as long as they have the American security guarantee and the American, basically, diplomatic guarantee that enables them to continue on the path that they're on. Were I an Israeli, given the relationship between the United States and Israel, I wouldn't have any interest in a two-state solution. It makes no sense from their point of view. Status quo is good, and they're going to continue to think that way as long as we give them reason to think that way.
But can I urge you to go back on the speculative mode? So I understand that the U.S.
I'm a historian, and all we're doing is talking about the future. I just want to point out
but you're trained
that
to look at the longer
never claimed that right. My crystal ball is that good.
Not the crystal ball, but other countries have gotten a free pass because the U.S. is willing to put its gold and treasure and life on the line. If the U.S. were to step back, what do you think would happen? What would the Europeans do? Would they also keep stepping back? The Russians, the Chinese you already mentioned. But it's not as if just the region will play out.
Well, I mean, so what you're doing is to put the issue in a truly global perspective. And I think that gets to the question of how we might envision the global order of the 21st century. There are a considerable number of Americans, particularly those who want to play a role in Washington, who will insist that the 21st century will continue to be an American century, by which they mean that the United States will be the sole superpower. I ain't buying that. I think that it is not simply inevitable, I think it's already happened, that there is emerging a multipolar order. Certainly, we will continue to be probably the preeminent power in that multipolar order, but it will be a multipolar order. That is to say, there will be some number of parties whose concerns are going to have to be reckoned with regard to any major issue of global affairs. Who's on that list? Well, China's on that list. India's on that list. The European Union's on that list. Russia is on that list, although, frankly, as a somewhat lesser, as a lesser power. Arguably, in that second tier of still very important states is Turkey, is Brazil. And whether or not we collectively, humankind, is able to have the 21st century be less catastrophic than the 20th century is going to depend on whether or not that collection of very powerful actors are going to find a way to live in relative harmony with one another. That is the big question. That's a question that orders of magnitude more important than anything going on in the greater Middle East, orders of magnitude more important than something like ISIS. Can we, the Chinese, the Indians, the Europeans, the Russians, live on the same planet without blowing things up?
That's a Pardee school statement.
Well, I'm just posing the question. I'm not saying, I don't know what the answer is, but in a sense, addressing the problems of the greater Middle East, that needs to be seen as a subset of the larger question of constructing a stable multipolar order.
One more round of questions. Lady here. And then.
First of all, I respect you enormously. I have followed your writings and everything.
There's going to be a big but coming here.
No, there's no but. It's just that there's, well, in a way there is. I'm a feminist, and not one word has been said about women in any of these countries. And until women get the voice, they're being killed and raped and everything by this group called ISIS, which I agree with you. I think that they're not going to get anywhere because, I don't know, just this morning I read in the paper, I didn't read the whole article, but that Saudi Arabia and some of these other countries are getting together to do something on a Sunni kind of response. I don't know. But the point is, the women, I mean, as much, I'm sure you don't like Hillary Clinton. I do. But the thing is, she brought women to the forefront of political discussion when she was in the White House. And until women get freedoms, I mean, until they can drive, I guess, openly in Saudi Arabia, I mean, just, you got to, there are women out there too. That's all.
Just to your left, if you pass the mic to Professor Ullman.
Thank you. I'm not sure Hillary Clinton has improved our Middle East posture very much, but I agree with you about her bringing higher profile to women. I was wondering, in some ways your remarks suggest that this big question of confronting modernity in the Middle East is somehow a new thing, or that it hasn't yet arrived. I would argue that it certainly has.
Question hasn't arrived, or modernity hasn't?
Modernity hasn't arrived. Modernity certainly has arrived, and the responses to it have been varied, and most of them not to our liking. And I was just thinking, when we talk about ISIS, which is an extreme response to, in part, to this question, granted, and it's a military, very viral, very extreme part. Perhaps there's no way to confront it other than by military means. But there's a much broader spectrum in which we haven't done so well, I don't think, as a country. Mentioning, for example, our responses to the attempted outbreak of democracy in places like Algeria, the Palestinian elections, and Egypt. Are we prepared, or do you have any evidence in your travels and readings and so on, that anybody in Washington is prepared to imagine a response to modernity that doesn't fit our paradigm? In other words, this question of modernity and how people are going to respond to it might very well have a real different answer in an area like the greater Middle East. Is there any evidence we're prepared to live with, or to assist, or to participate in fashioning this, perhaps not military, but an answer that we're not particularly comfortable with, that involves way too much religion for our tastes, etc.?
Yeah. One more question here, and then we'll.
Okay, so my question goes to your question about, or your statement about picking up your marbles and leaving. Historically,
that was obviously a mistake. I'd like to revoke that. We'll edit that out of the talk.
Okay, well,
sorry, go ahead.
Kind of going with that, historically speaking, a lot of the extremist groups that crop up have declared war on kind of Western ideals, whether it be ISIS or whether it be the Muslim Brotherhood just after World War I. A lot of the founding thinkers of the Muslim Brotherhood, such as Qutb, declared war on European Western ideals. So if we were to do what you suggest, pick up those marbles and leave, would you see that launching the U.S. into sort of a period of defense where we're under attack all of a sudden because we aren't flexing our muscles and showing our strength?
So 3 questions: women, modernity, and can we live with modernity if it really comes, and is the war on the West, or their perception of war on the West, and what that means?
Well, I mean, all 3 questions actually connect in a way. I mean, let me go to Professor Rollman's first, in a way. So when democracy crops up, the United States, we stand for democracy. We support the people. When democracy crops up, if it's a democracy that doesn't somehow fit our approval, we turn against it. We either deny it legitimacy, attempt to overthrow it, revoke any support. And I think that in every case we've done that, it's been a strategic error. I mean, if we take the case of Egypt, I don't question, it was, best I can tell, it was a legitimate election that brought the Muslim Brotherhood to power. Best I can tell, as a distant observer, the Muslim Brotherhood is really screwing up and had demonstrated a high level of incompetence and stupidity. That said, they got a right to do that. And I think that when the United States accepted and has really now endorsed, has embraced the military's takeover of the government, that was a profound error on our part. It was a profound error in Algeria. It was a profound error in the West Bank and Gaza when Hamas prevailed in an election. Our position should be that people have the right to choose whatever government they wish to choose, and that our position should be one of then supporting change under constitutional terms, not through extra constitutional intervention. Now, if you buy into that, then you buy into the notion that women may not necessarily be treated as well as we want them to, based on our standards. Although, of course, you can punch a whole lot of holes in our standards about way women are treated and objectified, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But really, I don't know as a practical matter what you would have us do. We are currently withdrawing from Afghanistan. It's hard for me to be optimistic about the fate of Afghanistan. It's hard for me to be optimistic about the fate of Afghan women once the withdrawal of Western forces is complete. But what would you have us do? It's the longest war in American history. Well, I'm for education. I just don't see that we can undertake a permanent occupation of Afghanistan in order to supervise the education of young people in that country. And I would note parenthetically, we ain't necessarily doing a great job of educating young people in our own country. So when it comes to questions of women or frankly more broadly humanitarian considerations, the well-being of people, then we have to ask, practically speaking, what can we do? And I don't think that the answer should begin with, well, let's invade an occupied country and teach them how to do it right. Perhaps we can bring Afghan women to this country in much larger numbers to receive an education if we can persuade the American people to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars in that enterprise. That would be a practical thing that could be done. But I'm just not buying this notion that somehow an American military presence provides a long-term solution to the condition of women in certain parts of the world. So if we picked up our marbles, would there be a war on Western ideals? It seems to me that in many respects, the American military presence is what facilitates, justifies, legitimizes this war on Western ideals. And picking up our marbles, to my mind, means a demilitarization of U.S. policy. It doesn't necessarily mean an utter, complete, and total disengagement from the rest of the world. As I tried to suggest in an early question, it seems to me that there are ways on the margins where one can have a positive influence without making any claim of being able to fix the world. And how would one do that? Well, one would do that through cultural exchanges, educational exchanges. Above all, one could do that by demonstrating that there is no fundamental conflict between modernity and faith. To live up to the liberal ideals that we profess and thereby demonstrate that those ideals are not consistent with a belief in God or even inconsistent with the conviction that God exercises a controlling power in the universe. That's what I think.
Are you game for one more quick round of questions?
Sure.
Lady here.
Hi, I've been taking your MOOC, and I'm impressed with the Patriot Act and with the militarization of our police and with your the statement of Bourne that war is the health of the state. And so I don't know how to phrase this question, but so far everybody's been dealing with what's going on over there, and I'm concerned about that this is a thread and this supervision, you know, all the national security stuff that we are being imposed on. And so that's what I'd like you to address for a bit.
We have two questions both on the front row here. You and then Ambassador here.
Earlier you mentioned that the campaign for the presidency starts tomorrow. And you've been talking about the different lobbies that are involved in national policy. My question is more of, is there an issue with the way our democracy is shaped, that the fact that we are constantly campaigning? Is it an issue with our structure, the way that our government is created, that fosters this permanency, this status quo that keeps on getting perpetuated by government after government? And is that a fault at the way that we have been created and have grown as a nation in terms of the result of this policy?
Last question, Ambassador Paul here.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Andy. I just wondered how far you would accept that some of the US presence and interventions in the Middle East has been conditioned by defending some of the pillars of what has been termed the world that America built. The first Gulf War is an example. Defending sovereignty, however perhaps controversial, the non-proliferation treaties, trying to prevent every country in the Middle East, of course, following Israel's example by offering umbrellas of protection and so on. And the whole period of inspections in Iraq was largely to defend UN resolutions and important institutions. And so I think one could argue that not all of it has been wasteful, it's been necessary, unless all that would fall apart. I'd be interested to hear your views.
Well, I mean, I agree with the premise of your question, that the domestic implications, privacy, rule of law, the compromises that have been justified by the need to pursue this war have done considerable damage to the country. There's considerable sort of talk about that, which suggests a recognition of the problem, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of political, that talk has not translated into real political traction that causes people in Washington to do something about it. I'm glad that you liked Randolph Bourne. I used to impose him on my students here. And his essay, The State, really is more important today than it was when he wrote it back during World War I. The questions about American politics are great questions. I don't know that I have much to offer on them. The two things that I would like to do, one would be to replace our current political system with a cabinet system, which would make it easier, I think, for us to throw people out of office. And the second thing is, it would just be terrific if we actually had two parties, particularly on matters that relate to foreign policy and national security. were there to be a real debate choice, then we the people would be educated, and arguably we the people would then come to recognize that there are choices other than the different flavors of vanilla that we get from both the Republicans and the Democrats. Paul, I think I take your point, and if you were going to ask me which of those sundry interventions I would find most justifiable, I'd point to the 1991 Gulf War. I do think that the United States had to act, had to make clear that certain norms needed to be enforced, could not be violated without severe penalties. I think George W. Bush, or Herbert Walker Bush, acted very commendably in the way he put together a coalition, in the way he got United Nations approval. I think he probably actually defined the mission correctly. In other words, liberate Kuwait rather than go to Baghdad. And yet at the end of the day, it's important to recognize that things went badly awry. And they went badly awry because the expectation that Saddam would be overthrown didn't come to pass. To some degree, the fact that he survived was a result of errors made on the battlefield by people like General Schwarzkopf in negotiating the terms of the ceasefire at Safwan. And therefore, even that most necessary, and in some respects most successful intervention, is an object lesson in how the use of American military power in those parts of the world ends up yielding consequences that are unexpected and new complications, because it was the failure to overthrow Saddam, or the disappointment of our expectations that he would be overthrown, that then led directly to the imposition of the no-fly zones, to the decisions to permanently garrison U.S. forces in places like Saudi Arabia, with enormous implications in terms of violating religious sensitivities, and on and on and on. So I remember the President Bush, famously in his diary, the night of the ceasefire in February of 1991, wrote, something doesn't seem right. He wrote, there's been no surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri, referring to the way the Pacific War ended. And his suspicions were correct, and just need to be aware of that, that's all.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much. But before I thank you formally, let me once again thank all of you here in the audience to have joined us to celebrate the beginning of our school, but much more to celebrate also the ideas, the career of our colleague, Professor of History, Professor of International Relations, a colleague, a friend for so many years to all of us here at Boston University. So thank you very much for joining us in the celebration of ideas in the best way that ideas can be celebrated, which is by sharing them. But there is a little more celebration at the back of the room. I hope you will join us for that. But please thank me in thanking Andy Bacevich. Thank you.